you, Stroma. That was very, very on point. And with that, we're going to start with the contributors and their discussion of their chapters. So first on least, we have Claudia Eger, who's going to be talking about that theoretical approximation to gender-based violence, those critical debates in the introductory chapter.
Thank you so much, Paola, and thank you so much for this inspiring talk, Stroma. So now I would like to continue actually introducing very much the first chapter of the book, which written together with Paola and Hedda. And it kind of also continues a little bit what Stroma was introducing, that I think gender-based violence has a very long history of being silenced within the traditionally male-dominated social sciences. And I think tourism is no different here, where the politics also of naming violence are highly complex. And as Stroma was highlighting, tourism is one of the industries much prone to sexual harassment due to prevalent emotional and static labor dimensions, but which then also combine with long working hours, alcohol, close contact with customers. But I think studying gender-based violence in tourism also allows us a perspective on the gendered violence that female travelers encounter during their journeys, which we actually know very, very little of. And we started our introduction in the book actually with a quote from a Colombian Caribbean journalist, Catalina Ruiz Navarro, who says, "Let's think of all the things that women can't do, all the places we can't go. Do you think that is equality? Gender-based violence, sexual harassment, femicide, and rape, all those built imaginary barriers delimiting those places where women can't go." And this, I think those imaginary barriers and also the accompanying silences, which will not protect women from violence, echoing the words of Audre Lorde. And there is no empowering form of silence when we consider gendered violence. And as Paula was also mentioning, I mean, while most victims of gender-based violence are women, also men, boys, and sexual minorities suffer from gender-based violence. And that's primarily due to pervasiveness of heteronormative and Western-centric construction of violence. And actually, we often do not speak of the violence that has happened, also resting on those socio-historical imbalances between genders and the intersection with other forms of identification and difference. And we cannot speak of the violence that actually hasn't happened. But I think the possibility thereof, the risk is materialized in women's travel patterns and working lives. And this might also explain why in the relatively few studies we have centered on violence against women in travel and tourism, there's a tendency really to focus primarily on individual risk perceptions. However, these are not individual necessarily to start with, as women's risk perception as such are shaped by the wider cultural context that reproduces specific gender norms, establishing then also the boundaries of where women can go and cannot go, as Catalina Ruiz Navarro was saying. And in the social sciences, we see that a dominant approach to actually account for violence is equation with physical force taken against human life. And I mean, while this allows us then to look at violence that has happened, quantifying that violence, this approach also limits our possibility to understand, okay, what are then really the underlying mechanisms that are reproducing the same violence and gender inequality, and also to understand how to prevent violence, I think, to happening in the first place. And I think that's one of the core messages also, that we need to be sensitive that the difficulty of actually understanding violence, its non-referentiality, and it not necessarily being then property of just individual acts that happen, but rather of a kind of much wider complex embedding in a context and connection with wider patterns of discrimination in society, which differ from society to society, and which then also go back to the importance of recognizing this institutional character of gender-based violence. We also consider in the introduction, for example, law and legal studies, which often are kind of form-giving to definitions of gender-based violence. And I think here especially the work of McKinnon has been influential in actually defining or coining gender-based violence as an issue of sex discrimination and also as a human rights violation. emphasizing then potentially how legal advances in one way can create a lexicon in our struggle, and a wider struggle against different forms of harassment and violence. And here it's interesting also to see that the Istanbul Convention, I think it came out in 2011, is the first international treaty to actually contain a definition of gender as a socially constructed category, where we define women and men according to specifically assigned roles, behaviors, attitudes. And it also then establishes a firm link between actually eradication of violence and its connection to achieving gender equality. But the evidence on this is actually inconclusive, which there's often an assumption that increasing gender equality will lead then to less gender forms of violence. But I think in many countries, and Denmark is a case in point, we see that this is not the case. And I mean, Tanya will talk more about this, but I think some of the chapters also highlight in the way different legal systems also follow different gender ideologies, with many legislations then having definitions of gender-based violence which really fall short of all the dimensions it includes, and some defining it primarily in intimate partner violence, which then really exclude other forms of violence like sexual violence or trafficking of women. And I think that's where probably also tourism and sex tourism specifically, we could say, is the most pronounced example of gender-based violence in tourism. And Tanya Kiriasi will talk more about this kind of real complex link also that exists between human trafficking and tourism. But what we kind of arrive at is that I mean, really difficulty that we encountered in naming this phenomena, which is very much tied to many structural and potentially also structural disfigurations we encounter across different countries. And then to fight this institutionalization of inequality, specifically gender-based violence, we need to start challenging, I think, also transforming. With Stroma was giving some very good examples of how to do that, but the same structures actually that then serve to isolate and silence victims, who actually themselves are often constructed as a problem. And I think here the chapter written by Jocelyn Filnier and colleagues is very interesting, focusing on specifically on how the tourism academy and the chilly climate that we have in higher education, also how this is maintained through the organizations in which through organizational collusion. So many third-party actors such as line managers, human resource managers, or colleagues, which actually function to often silence also gender-based violence. So I think it's not only the psychology of the violator or the violator that needs close attention, but also the bystander, the silent third party, to understand how actually gender-based violence is reproduced and legitimized in tourism. And I think that's one of the key aspects that emerges in the introductions, that actually naming gendered violence in tourism emerges as a key political and ethical task. And I think we are thankful to all the contributors to our book and everybody who's also attending today. I think it's especially the contributors who have called out then the long tradition of sexual harassment in the tourism industry, contributing also new ways of how we can resist potential forms of gender-based violence, and then also exploring especially this wider inhumane power geometries in tourism that underpin and make gender-based violence possible in tourism. Yeah, thank you.